Rolex Releases Part 2. This has been a very fun series and I hope you've been enjoying it. This episode's going to be different to the first one. The first part, which I will link in the corner of the screen, looks at the more documentative developmental process that we've seen when it comes to Rolex and their incremental releases and just how they generally honor their anniversary releases. Now, this is also going to be more of a creative exercise where we're going to further expand and evolve a few concepts that I've wanted to take forward, primarily linked to the Explorer and the Ranger lines of pieces. So it'll make a bit more sense later on. If the scheduling and planning is correct, this video should be out by April 1st. So happy April Fool's Day. Now we could say that this is very much a fool's errand, the whole idea of discussing releases and predictions, and odds are it will never happen, but it's good to have a thought, and most of the time we seem to enjoy the progression and the development of these ideas more than the actual releases themselves. And as far as we know, we might be hearing news as early as April 7th on these new releases, which is quite surprising considering how recent last year's releases were. Between part 1 and this episode, there have been some leaks online. I guess we all have to take it with a pinch of salt, but what we have seen are a couple of Daytonas with different color schemes. And in this example, I've just taken one. Haven't put much effort into it, sadly. I guess that kind of sums up my belief that this will in fact be released, but this is the reference 116519. I've given it a navy bezel and navy subdials. Haven't taken it off its Oyster Flex bracelet. Is it possible that we will see a watch like this? I think it's not off the table. I think it's fully believable, considering how far back the Daytona has been left, and we haven't seen any new models in the steel category especially. This is a good example of a watch that they could in fact release to revamp the line. Another thing to pair it with when we see the navy color is how it links very nicely to the Rolex Submariner release from last year. How both of these watches could technically share the same color, and frankly this might be the most believable case out of this whole discussion today. But I sincerely hope that the Daytona is not the watch that gets these changes. This is the year of the Explorer, and hopefully these suggestions and ideas that I'll be sharing with you, something will come to light that resembles something similar in the final build. Before discussing the Rolex Explorer 2, let's first look back to its sibling. I think there was almost a unanimous agreement in that last video that the Tudor Ranger would be the star child, and if Tudor had the idea to decide to bring this watch back again, doing it properly, scaling it correctly, digging into those past references and using those nuances in their final idea. So the Ranger reveal was nice. It's a good looking watch, but since this is more of the creative side, the creative part to this series, let's dig a bit further, a little bit deeper into the area. And I'm thinking that when Tudor decided to bring out the Black Bay 58, the first watch that they introduced was a model with a gilt dial, gilt handset, gilt appearance. So in a few of these samples, I've taken the standard Ranger format and modified it in such a way that it looks even more upmarket, you could say, a little bit more formal. I'm sure most of us know that gilt dial watches are a lot more sought after in the vintage space. And I'm thinking between the two brands, Tudor is the one that can really capitalize on this idea. So in the first sample, I've made everything gilt, from the hands to the numerals, the batons, the typeface, the minute track, everything is gold. On one hand, we could say that it does look kind of heavy, but when we compare it next to the stainless steel finishes on all the other surfaces and the black dial, there seems to be three very distinct parts to this watch, which I think some would enjoy. It definitely doesn't look too old school in appearance, and I'm sure if this watch was actually realized, the lume on the batons, the hands, the type would be a bit different in color. So moving away from a more heavy gilt layout, the next approach, sample number 2, we see something that looks a little bit more believable, we could say. All the parts that we would expect to see loomed are white, and this also does break up the dial very well. The question is whether or not it affects the aesthetics. Now we could say that this watch looks a bit more modern with this layout. Even though it has gilt hands and all of those aspects, it still manages to look pretty contemporary, considering what we see on the market today. I think of all the samples, this is the one I enjoy the most. And then the next step to further evolve this idea, sample number 3, we find that Ranger has a red line of text. So if we were to imagine, close our eyes and imagine the idyllic form of the Tudor Ranger as this heritage watch that was going to be released, debuted in a similar format to the Black Bay 58 with a gilt dial, I think this is about as close as we would get to something that really hammers that home well. The chances of this being released, pretty slim, especially with things like the Tudor Rose on the dial, some of those other features, but I've tried to make it believable enough that it is the enthusiast's watch that we are wanting to see. In the next sample though, I backtrack and think, okay, let's make this realistic. What could we actually expect from the Tudor brand if they were to go down this route? And this is the sample of the Ranger that I believe is closest to what we would see. Everything is back to white, there's no gilt dial. Ranger stays in red, and we notice the biggest change. We remove one of the most iconic elements to this watch, which is the arrow handset, and instead snowflake hour and snowflake seconds hand. Also remove the rose from the dial and leave a shield up there, something that was very common with vintage Tudor Rangers as well. We should also remember that the vintage Tudor Ranger is very hard to categorize because there are so many. There are lots of differentiations to this line of watch that makes it very difficult to pinpoint. So on one hand, we could say that they have lots of areas to find inspiration if they were to go down this path and create an excellent final result for all of us to enjoy. Of all the releases this year, I hope this one is realized. You can tell that I am doubling down on this idea, but I believe it to be such a foolproof formula. And regardless on the direction exactly, if it does follow the same kind of blueprint that we've been talking about, 37, 38 millimeters in size, in-house movement, it's bound to be a success. Shifting across now to the Explorer 2. There's been a lengthy discussion in the first part of this video about the 1655 and those influences. What I wanted to do here was to make it a bit more believable in a few areas, evolving this idea, but then have a separate section near the end of this video where I go through a design exercise, progressively evolve this watch into what I would like, and really address the Explorer in a different way, trying to base my argument around how I see this watch and where it sits in the Rolex professional line. Most who are watching this probably know that in the first part I was discussing how green would be used to accent the prominent features of this watch since it is its 50th anniversary. But there was a brilliant comment left about this watch receiving an Oyster Flex bracelet. That's all it really needed. And it got me thinking, well, there is another recent model that is in fact in 42 millimeters in size, the white gold Yachtmaster, that got the same treatment a couple of years ago. Is it too unbelievable to think that the Explorer 2 could have the same approach applied? So in this example, I have widened the lugs of this watch, I've used the green accents on the Explorer text and on the hand. But you will also notice something else that's turning into quite the running theme of this, where I have extended the hour hand. And I think that adjustment will make a big difference to this line. Just the adjustment of the length of the hour hand. Later on you will see a side-by-side comparison of the two watches and it'll make a bit more sense. But with this layout, steel bezel, green accents, Oyster Flex strap, looks brilliant. It looks like an Explorer's watch. It does hammer home the utilitarian feel of this model. And I guess the only downside would be a lot of people on one side of the fence won't appreciate the whole idea of a rubber strap on a professional watch like this. Understandably so, this watch does deserve a bracelet. The way these straps are used on these models, you won't be able to replace it with a bracelet. So that's a bit of an issue. It's pretty funny because the last episode was looking mainly at the black dial model and how that would change. It's mainly because it's easier to work with. As a design, the colors are a bit easier to handle, but did in fact decide to look at the polar models. During the last part, we were talking about how the bezels could change, how we could see a ceramic bezel influence on the model. It's not completely out of the window, but the more I think about it, the more unbelievable it is. If anything, they might go down the route of a painted steel bezel instead. But looking at this polar model with a black bezel, it does look outstanding, especially now when you see the extended hour hand. The green accents on the dial too. It changes up the visual image of the watch entirely. You might have noticed that I've also widened the bracelet too. But this is all that really needs to be done to this watch when I look at it in particular. The polar dial variant does have a theme and a style to itself that doesn't really need much changing. It's easily identifiable, it's pretty simple, and with a few adjustments, the modern image of this watch could look fantastic. Probably one of the best in the professional line. On a side note, there was a suggestion that the Explorer should receive a green dial, but keep its orange accents. Now, where these two colors do work very well together, they generally do have this clash of bright and more neutral colors. On a watch dial, especially on a Rolex watch dial, they do conflict a lot. Let's get a bit philosophical for a second and explain the Explorer 2 and where I see it in the Rolex line, and why I find it to be quite a conflicting watch, actually. In the first part of the series, we looked at the development of the Explorer 2, from the 1655 to the Oliver Shepherd model that pretty much influenced the development of this line and has become the archetype of the Explorer 2. If we are to stack this watch next to the Submariner and the GMT, I mean, realistically, it's easy to identify. We can see it has a steel bezel and has orange accents. That's pretty much been the defining format to this piece. But to anyone in the street, to anyone who passes by these three watches, it must be so difficult to identify them because, let's be honest, they look virtually the same. My main gripe with the Explorer 2 is that it has so much potential to be its own watch, but it is very much in the shadows of the Submariner and the GMT. That's why I believe the 1655 gets so much attention and appreciation now especially, because it really did set the standard that was never followed through afterwards. And unfortunately, this model has kind of just fallen in line with the other two and hasn't exactly spread its wings on its own. Now, of course, the positives are it's a very identifiable watch. It's easy to use and function. Its actual practicality is very good. It's a very usable instrument for its purpose, and the steel fixed bezel does allow it to be used for its intended goal. But let's for a second imagine that a designer got a brief to evolve this watch using elements of the Explorer line and somehow making it easily identifiable as a watch by itself. The main goal was to eliminate all other influences except possibly the 1655 and the modern Explorer, the 214270, as the elements of inspiration. So in this first sample you see that the quarter Arabics have been added to the dial. It's a bit peculiar, and you'll see the next steps even worse. Notice that the hour hand has been extended outwards. The only main change to the dial are the Arabic numerals and the extended hour hand. Not stopping there and deciding to go even further, batons replacing plots on the dial and the Arabic numerals staying. Now this does kind of remind you of a different model in a Swiss watch line, and that is the Breitling Avenger. I feel like this shares some common characteristics here. And if we are to look at this realistically, you now essentially have an Explorer dial with a date complication, crown guards, and a GMT complication. An Explorer 1 2.0, we could say. But the next step got really interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this before, but removing the arrows on the bezel and replacing them with vertical lines, similar to the 1655, almost identical actually, does virtually change the entire identity and look of the watch. And I do like this approach. As great as this bezel format looks, it does seem extremely busy, kind of complicated for what it's trying to do. But that is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when we move to the next example. And here is the idea fully realized. The concept of only having batons on the dial. So essentially a professional watch that doesn't have any rounded plots, and there's a nice congruence between the batons and the vertical lines on the bezel. The way it looks, it gives off this functional feel. It does have GMT elements and components to it, but it also does feel like an Explorer as well. How similar does this watch look in comparison to the 1655? I will let you make that judgment yourself. I'll tell you also that I never used any watches really as a base of inspiration. I wanted to go through the process of adding and removing parts to get to a final result that feels quite cathartic in a way. And in the end, my main argument was to try and realize a watch that could stand by itself next to the Submariner and the GMT. You can see how easily it is to distinguish the Explorer from the two others. And if this model was to be released in a format like this, I think it would gain so much traction. It would be a very popular Explorer. It has this simplicity and this elegance, but also does look like it can hold its own, with a presentation of components and elements on the dial and bezel that don't seem too jarring. They seem to work together very well. And that's what you really want out of this model, something that is visually appealing but also functionally focused. And just for a bit of fun, to close off this discussion on the design exercises, since there's been lots of talk about discontinuation of the Milgauss of the Air King, I decided to put an Air King dial in an Explorer 2 case. And let's just say it's a bit cluttered. To hammer home what I said in the first part of this series is that the Explorer canvas is bare. There's so much opportunity to evolve it, to make it its own watch. And I really hope that Rolex does it, because of all the professional models, this one still feels like the one that is purely tool focused, built to be used and worn the way the originals were. It doesn't feel like this upscale luxury watch next to the others, and that's the beauty of it. So to sum up this video in a few words, I have very high expectations that we will be seeing the Explorer 2 evolved, possibly Tudor bringing out the Ranger. And deep down, I hope that if the Explorer 2 is adjusted and changed, it is done with efficiency in mind, with a thought to expand the line, instead of just repeating what has been done since the 80s, essentially. The new Explorer 2, especially now, during its 50th anniversary, deserves a facelift, deserves a bit more love. And if we are lucky, we will be pleasantly surprised in a week's time.